Going through a breakup can be brutal. That whole idea of someone dying from a broken heart, that's a real thing. That's an actual medically recognized condition. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about things like that. First off, the biopsychology of breakups. So what are some of the changes that are going on in your brain? What are some of the impacts that it has on your body when you go through a split? Then we're going to move on to the behavioral psychology of breakups. And this will be a little more practically oriented. What are some tools from operant conditioning and classical conditioning to help with the transition on to the next phase? And then last, we're going to look at, what does healthy love look like? If you're finding yourself jumping in and out of relationships, like every 2 months, you fall in and out of love, there are some theories in psych, especially one called Sternberg's triangular theory of love, that we'll look at, and we'll kind of see if it can lay out a roadmap or answer some questions as to why some of these, the same patterns may be popping up in your personal life. So first of all, the biopsychology of breakups. A lot of psychologists and researchers model romantic breakups in a way that parallels bereavement, actually the process of grieving someone that you have lost to a death. And this is not an overly dramatic characterization of romance. There's actually a really good argument for this as far as empirical studies go. People that are experiencing bereavement and people that are experiencing particularly severe breakups oftentimes exhibit very similar symptoms and mental processes. So insomnia, intrusive thoughts that you have a hard time filtering out that cause aversive emotions like anxiety and depression. These are all things that you experience in both cases. We can sometimes see breakups as an external loss. You're missing someone that was in your external environment that is now no longer there. But this model really frames it as an internal process as well. This person was more than a friend or a roommate. They were a core part of your internal identity. Our identity doesn't exist in a vacuum. It develops in reference to the most important things in our lives. Your job, family, your hobbies, your significant others. These are the mirrors that we hold up and that we see ourselves through. You are defined internally, your worth as a person, your place in society, the role that you serve, and kind of the larger purpose of your life in a lot of ways are defined by those relationships. And losing one of those relationships, so losing your job is a great example, that's a heavy thing. That's more than just losing income. That's losing a part of your self-worth and identity. And similarly, losing a very serious relationship. We're not talking about someone you dated twice and then never called back or they didn't call you back. We're talking about a very deep and long-lasting relationship. Over time, your identity might kind of fuse with this person, and losing them can feel like losing a significant chunk of yourself in that way. This is going to leave a large void that, it'll take time to heal and to ultimately fill with other things, other aspects of yourself. Now, on top of all that, people that are in long-term relationships develop what psychologists call co-regulation. So you know this person so well that you can pick up on little tiny, subtle body language cues that the average person might miss. But that means they're starting to feel overwhelmed or feel anxiety or depression. And as the partner that can read those cues, you make moves to help them regulate whatever that aversive emotion is. So you go to put your arm around them, pat them on the back, hold their hand. And over time, you start doing this for each other, and you start kind of relying on each other for this internal regulation. They become a part of how you process particularly difficult things and experiences that you go through in life. Now you have this breakup. Number one, not only are you experiencing a particularly difficult challenge in your personal life, but number two, you've suddenly lost one of the primary tools that you have historically used to regulate your emotions and process things like grief, sadness, anxiety, and loss. So breakups can have this feedback loop effect where not only are you carrying an exceptionally heavy emotional load, but you now have fewer emotional resources with which to process what you're going through. And this can be extremely stressful, not just emotionally, but physically as well. When you experience a stressful event, you have a pop quiz in a class, or you get fired from your job, or you're going through a breakup, your body releases what are called stress hormones. adrenaline, cortisol. These activate a stress response in your body. Things like your sympathetic nervous system are involved in that. And you can kind of think of it as pressing the gas pedal on your physiological functioning. You're increasing your heart rate. You're increasing your respiration rate. And this can be good for dealing with a short-term stressor, but it's not a great long-term strategy. You can imagine if you're always hitting the gas pedal in your car, eventually you're going to wear out the engine. And the same thing can go for the human body. Specifically, the heart can be overwhelmed by the sudden influx of stress hormones like adrenaline, and this can cause a narrowing of small arteries that feed blood to the heart, and this will lead to a temporary reduction in the amount of blood that's actually flowing to and getting to the heart. On top of that, the adrenaline can bind to some of these heart cells directly and sort of mess up the flow of ions like calcium and stuff that gets down to a cellular level. But the overall impact is it effectively can stun the heart. Now, all of this can feel very much like an actual heart attack, chest pain, and all that. It's not really a heart attack in a classical sense, though. I mean, typically with a heart attack, you've got some kind of a blockage or a blood clot in one of the coronary arteries, and this reduces blood flow to the heart. And if it goes on long enough, that lack of blood flow will cause the heart cells to die. And if you do recover, you have sometimes irreversible damage like scarring. In the case of this broken heart syndrome, where you're experiencing just an influx of stress hormones, there's no blockage. There's no larger coronary disease that can be identified when you go to the hospital, and it's totally reversible. If you can bring those stress hormones down, there's no larger permanent damage that typically occurs in these cases. So there's a pretty high recovery rate. On average, in a healthy individual, this is not the kind of thing that you expect to have fatal implications, but it's very real. It's a very real cardiac event that can occur as a result of effectively what you would poetically think of as a broken heart and all the physiological changes that stem from that psychological state. One of the hardest parts of a breakup can be running into things. So, a song or a smell or a place that reminds you of your ex. And this is what in psychology we would call classical conditioning. And this is where you take something that's otherwise neutral. So the smell of a type of shampoo or a particular song that comes on the radio that you don't have a strong emotional attachment to when you're born. It's not an innate thing. But over time, as you pair it with something that does have meaning to you, it starts to kind of rub off and actually develop a larger meaning. For example, if there's a certain song that you and your ex listen to a whole lot, or a shampoo or a perfume or cologne they use, you take this thing that would normally be neutral, a smell or a sound, and you pair it with this person that you have very strong feelings for, and eventually that smell or that sound by itself will also elicit those feelings and those memories and those thoughts. We use the same principle in animal training a lot. I mean, just think of if you have a dog at home, if you say, want to go for a walk, right? That word walk means nothing to a dog. When it's first born, they don't understand English language or language in general. But what you're doing is you're taking something that otherwise is a very neutral stimulus to an animal, the word walk, human language, and you're pairing it with something that's very meaningful to them. Whenever I say the word walk, I take them outside. They get to go see new things, smell new things, play in a park. And so over time, they start to associate what was a neutral stimulus, the word walk, with this very exciting thing that they innately and naturally love. So how do we undo this? Because in a breakup, all of these cues that are constantly reminding you of the things they had previously been paired with, again, songs, smells, restaurants, movies, whatever, these are things that are causing pain. The memories they're now paired with and they're eliciting are aversive. They're very excruciating to be constantly reminded of. So how do we break this pairing? Let's go back to this dog that's going for a walk. You can just sit there and just use the word walk a bunch around the house and just never pair it with going for an actual walk again. And over time, that pairing will go through something we call extinction. So that dog will get excited the first few times it hears the word, but over the course of several repetitions of that word and no actual walk is paired with it, eventually the word will begin to lose its meaning. Now, this can take a long time. So if we apply this to, the smell of your ex's cologne or perfume, eventually, after enough exposures and no repeated pairing with that person, it will begin to lose its meaning. But but that can take a very, very long time. So a quicker way we can do this is not just wait for that association to slowly die on its own, but replace it with something. So for the example of this dog, right? If we say, want to go for a walk, and then we take the dog to the vet, they are very quickly going to change their association, much faster than if we just let this thing naturally go through an extinction process. If we actually pair it with something that has a very different emotional meaning to it, now we say, I want to go for a walk, and after probably just a few repetitions, that dog's not going to come running and wagging its tail. It might go hide in the backyard. So in the case of a breakup, if there's a certain stimulus that's constantly reminding you of your ex, maybe expose yourself to it intentionally in very specific moments when you're surrounded by other stimuli. If it's a song, for instance, maybe you go out with your buddies, you go out with your friends in a way that is getting your mind off everything you're going through. And right in the middle of having a great time with them, when the party is at its climactic moment, everyone's dancing, you're happy, you're distracted, maybe work that song into the playlist. And it will be painful the first time and the second time and the third time. But if you keep on pairing it with something else that's meaningful, you will expedite that extinction process or the replacement process in this case. And the old pairings will fade much more quickly. So that's great if it's you that's having a hard time moving on. But what if it's your ex that's having a hard time? What if you have a particularly clingy ex? You ever had a situation where you pick up your phone and there's like 20 missed calls and 40 plus text messages from them over the course of like 15 minutes. Behavioral psychology can actually shed some light on this too. What's happening in this case is what psychologists call an extinction burst. And it's similar to that concept of extinction we just mentioned a minute ago. So to better understand this, we need to draw on sort of a subset of behavioral psychology called operant conditioning. The idea behind this is if you want a behavior to happen more frequently in a person or an animal, you just reinforce it, you reward it. So if a kid goes off and they study really hard for an exam and they do a great job, you give them an A. They're more likely to study again the next time. If there's a behavior we don't want to occur again in the future, so like speeding on the freeway, if you're going 110 miles an hour, what do? We punish it. And that's what a speeding ticket is. You reward behaviors that you want to make more frequent, and you punish behaviors that you want to make less frequent. Now think about phone calls and texts. Why do we engage in those behaviors so frequently? Why do we pick up our phones so frequently? Because there must be something reinforcing about that behavior. You press send on that phone call or you send off that text. You do it because you, as the initiator, want a response. You find a response from that person to be reinforcing. You like engaging with and communicating with that individual. And conversely, every time you pick up a phone call from someone or every time you respond to a text, you're reinforcing their behavior. So what if you want someone to stop calling, to stop texting? This should be as simple as just not responding anymore, right? Not texting back and not picking up the phone. It's not quite that simple. So after a behavior has been reinforced for a long period of time, and if all of a sudden you just stop reinforcing it, it doesn't just all of a sudden go extinct. First, it goes through a temporary period called an extinction burst, where it actually becomes more frequent. So for example, if you put a mouse in a cage with a lever, and every time they push this lever, a food pellet, a treat comes down a chute, they get to eat it. That's reinforcing. So the mouse is going to engage in that behavior, pushing the lever more frequently. That's the whole point of reinforcement. So now it pushes a lever, it gets a treat, pushes a lever, it gets a treat. Now, what if you stop sending treats down that chute? You remove the treats. So it pushes the lever, nothing happens. It doesn't just stop pushing the lever all of a sudden. It's going to push it again and again. And then it's going to kind of spam that lever and just to really make sure that nothing's happening. That's an extinction burst. The behavior that has historically been reinforced will actually temporarily increase dramatically after you stop reinforcing it. Now, ultimately, it goes extinct and it does die off, but it takes a minute. Now, let's move the focus back to these unwanted texts and phone calls. If someone makes a call or sends you a text, they're hoping to elicit some kind of a response. Even if you're arguing and the response is just, don't ever call me again, it's still a response. It's still some kind of contact and connection. So when they send it off, they get nothing. That's that mouse hitting the pedal and no pellet comes down. So what do? They hit the pedal again and again and again. And now you have 40 text messages in your inbox. The worst thing you can do in this scenario is reinforce the extinction burst when it's at its peak. At that point, you're not just reinforcing the base behavior, sending a text messages. You're reinforcing an amplified version of the behavior, sending 40 text messages. And the next time you go through that extinction burst, it's going to get even higher because you've reinforced it at that accelerated level. So what do? Do not, under any circumstances, respond. After you say, I'm done, this is it, just leave your phone off, block them if you have to. Ultimately, extinction bursts come back down. But in the training world and the psychology world, they're notorious for being almost like a test of faith because they accelerate for so long and they go on for so long that even when you're aware that it's an extinction burst, you know what's happening, it can be very, very difficult to stick with the plan. You can convince yourself that, no, this is never going to end. This is going to get worse and worse and worse. Eventually it does. Now, that being said, I want to make a point of saying this behavior can also escalate to a point where it becomes illegal harassment or something that will qualify as stalking. And in that case, it's a whole different category. And I'm going to put a link in the description to point you in the direction of some resources if you're experiencing intimate partner violence or things that escalate to that level. And it can put you in touch with organizations and groups locally that can help you out. Last, what does healthy love look like? This is a great question, and there is no 100% universal answer, but there is a theory or a model of love that I personally like a lot. This guy Sternberg put it together, and it's called the Sternberg's triangular theory of love. And you can see each of these 3 points of the triangle represent a different manifestation or a different perspective or dimension of love. So he argued that love can manifest in a whole range of different ways, but each of those different manifestations will be composed of the same 3 components. Now, each component will be present at higher or lower levels in each case, but those 3 components are liking, so intimacy, how close you are with that person. This can also be liking by itself would be just a very, very good, close best friend that's platonic. Another example would be commitment. That's one other dimension of this. Commitment is just making the decision to be together. This is empty love when it is commitment by itself. It's we're married, but I don't like you. You're not my friend, and I'm not physically attracted to you. And then the last piece of this is infatuation, the passion side of the triangle. Again, by itself, passion is without commitment and without liking is sort of love at first sight. I guess you might describe it that way. The butterflies you get on a first date, that kind of thing. You don't know that person very well, so the intimacy isn't quite there. And there's no larger decision to commit or be in a relationship or be married. So that's just the kind of the adrenaline aspect of sexual attraction by itself. Now, Sternberg argued that love is going to evolve over the course of its life, and this is healthy. So typically early on, you have a lot of the passion side of that triangle, infatuation, and that's, a new relationship where you're excited and you can't stop thinking of the person and your heart's in your throat. And then as you evolve and grow in that relationship, other things will increase and the passion might decrease. And again, that's normal. The butterflies go away eventually. That's okay. When you've been with someone for 40 years, it's going to feel different than your very first date. What ideally will happen is as that passion decreases, other things like commitment or especially intimacy will increase, and the relationship will change in its composition, but ultimately will get stronger. The metaphor I like to use to kind of envision this is when like the space shuttle takes off, you have those giant rocket boosters. The whole point of those rocket boosters is just a ton of horsepower, a ton of thrust to get that shuttle off the Earth, through the atmosphere, and into space, into orbit. And then once those giant firework, massive rocket boosters have done their job and the space shuttle is in orbit, we can drop them. And then the space shuttle can just, with very little fuel, but in a very stable orbit, just kind of go around and around the planet as long as it needs to. And you can kind of think of a relationship the same way. Those rocket boosters are the passion side of the triangle. They're not meant to carry the relationship through its entire journey. They're meant to get it started, get it off the ground, and keep you together long enough to develop the next phase, which is a stable orbit, which is intimacy, and ultimately, commitment, a combination of the two. So as passion decreases over time, again, naturally, inevitably, it will. Now, it won't go away completely, but it will make up a smaller proportion, and intimacy and commitment will make up a larger proportion, and that's a healthy progression for a relationship. Now, think about how you define love. Like when I ask my students this question, I get a range of answers from it's your best friend, it's someone you can always depend on, someone that knows you better than anybody else. That's intimacy. To, you can't stop thinking about them, the butterfly thing. It feels like the whole world just melts away and all that's left is them. And you're staring into each other's eyes until 2 a.m. That's the passion side. Now, those are two very different sensations, but they're both how different people might describe the same word, the same concept in our culture, love. If you're the kind of person that defines love as the intimacy, as a connection that grows over time and gets stronger and stronger, you'll probably find, and studies actually show, people like that tend to gravitate more towards longer-term relationships and report falling more in love over time as they're with that person for a longer period of time. Intimacy grows. Now, people in these studies that report love as more of a passion-oriented concept are the ones that tend to, this is not always, but statistically are more likely to be falling in and out of love constantly. That makes sense, right? This butterfly, this passion aspect of it on its own will fade eventually. And if that's how you define love, you'll constantly be thinking, I am always falling out of love. The love is gone. The spark is gone. Well, must be time to move on. Well, no, that's just phase one. And it takes a different set of skills and goals and a different type of communication to cultivate that stable orbit, that phase two of intimacy and to some degree commitment as well. So if you're watching this video and you're finding that you're constantly hitting a wall in your relationships around 2 to 3 months where everything just kind of fades and you're not really into that person anymore, number one, it just may not be the right person. It's not that every single person you can be with forever if you just develop intimacy. Some people aren't a good match. But if it's the cyclical thing that's going on over and over, it might be worth sitting down and asking yourself, how do I define love? How would I describe it in 2 or 3 sentences to an alien from another planet that has no concept of what love is? How would I explain the most fundamental aspect of what love is? And think, where on this triangle is that description falling? That's it. Hope you found it interesting. Again, if you have any questions or any thoughts about future videos or thoughts about this one, leave them in the comments. And I tend to go through and try to respond and reply to them as often as possible. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you very much for watching.